Okay, so welcome everyone to our lecture for today, which is the 14th SOAS What Philosophies lecture organized by the Center for Global and Comparative Philosophies. We are very, very pleased to have today a very important guest, Professor Linda Martin Alcoff. She needs no introduction. I'm sure many of us know her work. She's a professor of philosophy at Hunter College at the Graduate Center and co-director of Mellon Public Humanities and Social Justice Scholars Program at the City University of New York. She's also past president of the American Philosophical Association, and her work cuts across areas of epistemology, Latin American philosophy, feminism, critical race theory, and continental philosophy. Many of us have used a number of her books. I'm sure many of us who teach epistemology use her edited work on epistemology. Epistemology is a big question. I know I do that a lot. It's a fantastic collection. She is also the author of Race and Resistance, The Future of Whiteness, and a lot of other books, as well as the editor of 11 books, co-editor of about 11 books, the Routledge Companion to the Philosophy of Race, Feminist Epistemology, Thinking from the Underside of History, Identities, Politics Reconsidered, and others. So thank you so much, Linda, for agreeing to give this lecture, and you'll be speaking on the epistemic value of diversity. And you have the floor, and we'll be happy to engage with you when you're done. So you're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I'm a big fan of SOAS, as I was telling Elvis, for years. I think you guys do an amazing work in the heart of the empire. So I'm very happy to be here. And this topic that I'm going to speak on, that you sort of asked me to sort of work in the area of, is going to give me a chance to do some to share with you some exploratory ideas that I'm working on. So I would love your feedback. I want to start with an example of the lace-on albatross, which are these funny little birds that live in Kaena Point and Hawaii. They look kind of like penguins, you know, they're kind of birds that stand. And the females only lay one egg per year, and they raise the egg, they protect the egg until it hatches in pair bonds. If you've seen the movie March of the Penguins, it's sort of like that. They're sort of like these penguin pair bonds that spend months together, sort of protecting a single egg. And since the 1940s, scientists knew that about a third of the lace-on albatross pair bonds were protecting two eggs rather than one egg, despite the fact that the female lace-on albatross can only lay one egg at a time. And so the scientists from the 40s on came up with these various hypotheses about why did they have two eggs. And they guessed that some other pair bond died, or some other female lace-on albatross died, and the eggs were laying around. So these, you know, they sort of foster parented these eggs. And it wasn't until about 20 years ago that a scientist asked the question, did anybody look under the feathers? A female scientist asked that question, and nobody had looked under the feathers. And when they did, they found out that the pair bonds that were protecting two eggs were female-female pair bonds. So that was about 31% of the lace-on albatross community in Kaena Point, Hawaii, were female-female pair bonds. And this is just one small example to show that, you know, it took 50 years or more before a scientific community that, you know, spends their lives studying these things, thought to ask this question. And of course, now there's lots of debate among the scientists about further understanding these female-female pair bonds, which are lifelong, because the Laysan albatross are lifelong monogamous pairs. So there's lots of, you know, ongoing debate about how to understand this. But it's just one small example of the difference that diversifying a scientific research team can make. So what I want to focus on today is diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that are popping up all over institutions and organizations in the United States, and I know in Europe as well these days. And these initiatives, these diversity initiatives, are criticized from a variety of political points of view. Lots of conservatives are concerned that DEI initiatives promote confrontation over collaboration. You know, they're promoting divisiveness. And to quote a recent critic, they are expressions of wokeness, which they say is, quote, the ability to become outraged at imagined enemies and create ways to be seen as a victim despite your privilege. Our Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, sees the wokeness that fuels DEI initiatives as a kind of ideology that blocks open discussion, limiting rather than expanding the public sphere of communication. And some conservatives, of course, are pretty open about their view that diversity initiatives are a form of ethnic takeover or replacement. From the other side of the political spectrum, there have been long-standing concerns that diversity, equity, and inclusiveness initiatives are a form of public relations. Sarah Ahmed wrote a great book on this 10 years ago. In other words, that they're mainly intending to protect organizations and sometimes to cloak the bad practices of organizations in languages of social justice while making only very ephemeral changes. My colleague at CUNY, who's a trans theorist, Paisley Curra, has a wonderful paper on this called Goldman Sachs is Flying the Rainbow Flag. So the idea is that visual diversity can coexist with ongoing social injustice. So I'm obviously more on the side of the last group of critics, the left critics. But in the face of what is today an increasing conservative backlash against all diversity initiatives, we need to step back and consider in what way we want to define and defend diversity. We need to deepen the analysis of diversity, explore its pitfalls, and consider whether any of the conservative attacks have merit. And here's where I think philosophy can be quite helpful. If we take the diversity initiative language at its word and leave our cynicism behind for a moment, the claim is always that diversity advances justice, that it's, you know, that it's non-negotiable for justice, which is true. But this leaves open the question of how justice is being defined and whether its scope is being limited in some subtle way. But it also leaves behind the equally important or even more important issue, which is that diversity advances human knowledge in every sphere, including the sciences, as the Laysan albatross example is meant to show. And in this era of human history with so many crises that need innovative thinking, we need to improve our epistemic practices and used in problem solving. So in this talk, I'm going to give a cautious set of arguments in favor of diversity initiatives focused on the issue of epistemic outcomes. And then I'm also going to give some reasons to be critical of DEI again, in relation to epistemic outcomes. And as I think we'll see, the issues required for better epistemic outcomes are not disconnected from those required for just outcomes, but they can provide some guidance for how to expand our conceptions of justice. So, first, we need to clarify a bit what we mean by the word diversity. Diversity of what? It's a slippery word, it's a vague word, it's inherently ambiguous. Conservatives in the United States have taken hold of the term in recent years to criticize the left liberal lock on the professoriate in higher education. And what they do is they look at our faculties and they count the low numbers of Republican Party members, and they call this discrimination, and they demand parity. So in their interpretation, diversity refers to diversity of ideas or political orientation or values or the form of one's religious belief. Such forms of diversity, I think we can use a shorthand for this type of concern as the concern for political diversity. These concerns are certainly relevant to knowledge because uniformity of ideas and approaches limit the range of debate, whether it's simple proportion, but whether a simple proportionate representation of Republicans versus Democrats in any given university will bring good epistemic outcomes in today's world is, of course, debatable. But I think that the general idea that you want idea diversity, you want orientation diversity, that's not a bad thing in and of itself is right. There are some ideas, of course, that are not going to contribute productively. Holocaust denial is the usual example, but it's a good example. The inclusion of this position is just going to stymie discussion. Today, of course, there are wide-ranging, fierce debates over how to interpret World War II, how even to interpret the Holocaust and whether or not to see it, the Jewish Holocaust, as connected or related to other colonial genocides. So it's not that there's not a lot of debate. You don't need to bring the Holocaust deniers into the room to have a strong debate. I think having the Flat Earth Society represented at every geological conference is not going to advance epistemic outcomes. So we have to be willing to, draw the line, develop criteria to establish how to foreclose the range of views given in public space. But this isn't to say that, idea diversity isn't a legitimate concern. So the point here is that we can see there are different types of diversity. There's political diversity, there's values diversity, and not simply social identity diversity. This expansion of the meaning of diversity should not be rejected out of hand. That is, that one's political understanding and political values have an impact on how one goes about producing and judging knowledge claims. But it is important to add two elements to the idea of political diversity and values diversity that the conservatives generally do not. The first is that, as Elizabeth Anderson and many others have argued, values are legitimate orienting frames to inquiry. They orient our attention and motivate us to pose questions we seek to understand, like how do we understand the 31% of lace-on albatrosses that are female-female pair bonds? So values are not antithetical to good science, but a feature of every science. And it's helpful to observe the diverse knowledge projects that diverse values priorities have engendered over the last 75 years since higher education began to be diversified by social identity. So identity diversity has come with values diversity and political diversity, so that today we debate the gender gap in wages in a way that they didn't used to debate it. And this leads to the second overlooked point, that values are a starting point, but they're not to be taken as unrevisable. Our values or our politics are subject to both reasoned and empirical challenge. They can be modified, changed, even dropped. And this is why we need not fear the incursion of values into inquiry. To say that values provide orienting frames of inquiry should clue us into the fact that they're the start of inquiry, and that the subsequent inquiry may yield some new ideas. So values don't block or limit the capacity of reason to follow through if we understand the process of inquiry in good coherentist fashion as a feedback loop that should move in both or multiple directions. Our political values should also be amenable to changes as we come to new knowledge, and we should be able to recognize the sometimes foreshortened character of our knowledge projects because of the particular way our political and values approach has framed or limited the questions we pursue. So the point of having inclusive spaces of debate is not simply to voice our views and to count the votes, but to engage with one another in an openness toward possibly learning something new. This is what the democratic proceduralists argue. One of the ways we can legitimately limit who can be included is whether they're willing to listen and revise their views. So this gives us a way to begin thinking about political and values diversity in relation to collective knowing. It's a legitimate consideration, but when put in the context of knowledge projects, we need to move beyond proportional representation to more interactive conceptions in which starting orientations can be challenged or revised. Okay, so diversity is more commonly taken to refer to a diversity of social identities, that we should aim for achieving a diversity of social identities in our institutions at every level, not just in the custodial staff or the building maintenance. Advocates of identity diversity are, in my experience, well aware of the fact that identity diversity is insufficient by itself to ensure critical debate or critical thinking. Witness any of former President Trump's speeches where he's ringed by visible people of color in a carefully curated audience background. Yet, although identity diversity is never sufficient unto itself, it remains necessary for overall good epistemic outcomes. So I want to focus my remarks for a minute on why this is, but more importantly, what this means we should do. Valuing knowledge and valuing identity diversity are still pitted against each other in too many department search committee meetings. Academics don't often know how to measure concerns for identity diversity against neutral judgments of quality. Yet, as Lorraine Code argued many years ago, the problem starts with the way in which neutrality is operationalized and who is judging the quality of a candidate. Code targeted the basic epistemic setup that starts off many papers in epistemology, which is the formula S knows that P, where S is assumed to be a perfectly fungible knower whose identity has no proper or legitimate role in S's knowing. Yet the fact is that S's are not fungible. Whether a given S knows that P knows a given P is a potentially deadly threat deserving of a taser or a gunshot can very much depend on S's social identity, their race, where they live. Whether juries or judges can fairly assess such knowledge claims can also depend on their identities. And I think it's not only mistakes, but it's also good reasoning that's affected by the particularity of any given S. So the overall point Code made is that it is not clear we can develop adequate epistemic norms of practice if we use an abstract, decontextualized image of knowing, such that any given S can come to know any given P if they follow a specific set of epistemic practices or norms. This idea is still ongoing in epistemology, I'm sorry to say. And while we're trying to build better abstractions, of course, and maintain our obliviousness to the epistemic impact of identity, people are getting murdered. So moving epistemology into the real world of diverse communities and acknowledging the way in which power impacts our patterns and habits and what any given we has available to them requires a move to a non-ideal approach, to the formulation of corrective norms that may be relevant to some populations and not others, and to general mandates that are understood to be transitional rather than permanent. That's what a corrective approach does. And here's one other example. The U.S. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor came very close to getting rejected in the Senate confirmation hearings for espousing the idea that Code endorsed. Sotomayor had given a speech in 2002 to the Berkeley Law School explaining her disagreement with then Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court in the U.S. And O'Connor had stated that in her view, identity did not make a difference. What O'Connor said was that, quote, a wise old man and a wise old woman will reach the same conclusions in deciding cases, unquote. So against this view, Sotomayor laid out an argument that gender, race, and ethnicity do make a difference on the bench. Sotomayor argued in that speech that one's background experience makes a difference in one's baseline knowledge, the sort of things one knows without having to look anything up. Although it's true that we can all pursue knowledge beyond our baseline, the fact is that this can take more time and effort than some are willing to commit. As Sotomayor put it, some people are limited, quote, in their ability to understand the experiences of others, and others simply do not care. Perhaps more importantly, she claimed that personal experiences affect the facts that judges choose to see. And so from these considerations, she argued that social identities do make a difference to judgment, that a critical mass of women and people of color, or, quote, enough in enough cases, will make a difference in the process of judging as it occurs across the nation, she said. But she then qualified her claim in a number of ways. She noted that, of course, within every group, there are many individual differences of perspective, and she pointed to Justice Clarence Thomas as a well-known example. She argued that every judge should strive to reach beyond their baseline knowledge into unfamiliar areas. And by making this argument, we can surmise that Sotomayor does not believe that we are irremediably limited by our background knowledge and experience. And she explained that the empirical studies that are looking at whether different judges judge differently are just now beginning to be developed. When she was giving this speech, only 1.5% of the federal judiciary in the United States was African American, and only 1% was Latino or Latinx. When this is obviously insufficient data for reliable observations, but she based her claim that difference makes a difference on the bench, not on the results of empirical studies, but on epistemological arguments about the nature of judgment itself. And I think it's worth noting that the media and political storm that ensued when Sotomayor was nominated to the Supreme Court was conducted through a repetition of just one sentence from her Berkeley speech. The sentence was, quote, a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experiences would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life, unquote. So the epistemological arguments she used to amplify, support, and qualify that claim, arguments that I think are very widely held among the public, even a kind of common sense. Those arguments were not repeated, they were not aired at all, which made her conclusion look more questionable and possibly based on a form of identity essentialism. Also, for these remarks, it's useful to note that Sonia Sotomayor was vilified from coast to coast. She was called an anti-American racist, a reverse racist, a brown bigot, a member of an organization that was equivalent to the Ku Klux Klan, and someone who believed in identity justice, quote unquote. She was also referred to in the mainstream news outlets as a school marm, a broad, a Hispanic chick lady, a bully. And Rush Limbaugh announced that he was going to send her a vacuum cleaner so she could clean up after the Supreme Court meetings. There was so much controversy that in the actual confirmation hearings themselves, Sotomayor reneged on her Berkeley speech and repudiated her earlier views. She defined her judiciary philosophy as encapsulated in the dictum, fidelity to the law. And she asserted that the role of the judge is, quote, not to make law, but to apply the law, unquote. And you can contrast this with the view she espoused in her Berkeley speech, where she forthrightly supported the claim that judging is a form of power. I want to suggest that the storm of controversy that surrounded Sotomayor was not created simply because she was a Puerto Rican woman from the working class, whom the Republicans could not imagine being qualified, but because she had dared to validate her identity as relevant to her qualifications on the court. In the Berkeley speech, she validated identity as one legitimate consideration in advancing democratic deliberation. And in doing so, she transgressed the conventions of US politics, which require regular espousals of epistemic platitudes about judging from a position of neutrality and colorblindness. And it was precisely this transgression that she was required to publicly renounce before she could secure a position on the Supreme Court. The interesting fact, however, is that in everyday life, I would contend that nearly everyone operates in the way Sotomayor explains. I want to learn a new sport, and when a young, athletic-looking person tells me it's easy, I take that claim with a grain of salt. When I want to know what refugees are experiencing on the southern border, I want to hear first-person reports, so a variety of them to be sure. We have different experiences and baseline knowledges and motivations, and sometimes these are correlated to our social identities. This should not be a taboo claim in the public sphere. So there's more and more case studies, as well as new histories of the sciences, that show that diversity in worldview and experience enhances scientific progress. It expands the repertoire of hypotheses, evidential interpretations, and procedures for gathering and assessing data. I tried in my book, Visible Identities, to give an account of how social identities such as race and gender can have these epistemic effects through the differential hermeneutic backgrounds that include differences of history, experience, embodiment, and social position. So there's patterns to our differences that affect our knowledge and that connect to our diverse social identities, and we can articulate these patterns without assuming uniform interpretations or uniform political understandings of shared commonalities of experience. So we can, I think, with this concept of hermeneutic horizon, account both for the differences within groups as well as the pattern differences across groups, and yet see the epistemic salience of groups. I think the hermeneutic approach is particularly useful because then it can allow both for difference within groups and between groups. There is individual agency also on this kind of account, and in the individual acts of interpreting, judging, and conferring significance. To paraphrase Bernard Williams, something is given, but I must choose to take it up. In that statement, he was intentionally referring to our social identities, and suggesting that one way to understand our social identities is that they track distinct elements of the given. Okay, so these are the sorts of arguments that make a strong case for the pro side of the ledger on the legitimate relevance of social identity to knowledge and epistemic outcomes. Now let me speak to a couple of considerations that complicate this picture. In an important case initiated at the University of Michigan, Grutter versus Bollinger, the question of making social identity relevant to university admissions was debated and decided in an interesting way. The university's defense of its procedures made use of both educational and epistemic justifications. In terms of the educational benefit, the university argued that the success of some minority groups, and they identified African Americans and Hispanics, would be more likely if there was a critical mass of such students on campus. Otherwise, such students would feel isolated and self-conscious as spokespersons for their race. This is a quote in the court case. So the educational experience of these groups required a critical mass ensured by an affirmative action or race-conscious admissions process. In terms of the epistemic benefit of affirmative action, the university argued that significant inclusion of these groups would assist, quote, all students to think critically and re-examine stereotypes, unquote. It was this latter argument that drew fire from numerous critics who were concerned that students of color were being instrumentalized for the purpose of enhancing majority student social knowledge. If the court were to allow race to play a role in admissions, it should be for the benefit of marginalized communities, not for the benefit of majority privileged communities. The critics did not dispute that white student social knowledge would likely be enhanced by a diverse student body. But they were understandably concerned that benefits for whites not be the governing reason behind affirmative action. When the court ruled that race-conscious admissions would assist, quote, all students to think critically and re-examine stereotypes, unquote, one might wonder which groups of students need their stereotypes critically examined. This worry about instrumentalizing non-majority knowledge is legitimate in my view, and as we move into a new era where there is more acknowledgement of the epistemic value of diversity, I think it's one we should consider with some care. There is an uncomfortable extractivist logic here that students of color will be used to broaden the baseline knowledge of white students, and in this way perhaps adding to the advantages they already have on the job market. This is a case where we have to take the general norm, such as what I argued for in the first half of this paper, that diversity can enhance knowing. We need to take that general norm and consider it in a real world specific context. How would it likely play out here in this particular context, given the likely power dynamics in place? We might compare this to the case of pharmaceutical companies coming to a recognition of late that various indigenous groups have knowledge of the causative properties of specific local plants that might be commodifiable in pill form. The knowledge is recognized and credited more so than it was in the past, and then used for extractive projects. Recognizing the knowledge of others does not always benefit them. If institutional systems and values, including the flows of power and manner of validating knowledge claims, are held in place without being altered in any way, recognition of the epistemic value of identity diversity may bring about little social justice. If, for example, advancing the career aspirations of elite students is the measure of a university's value, then diverse student bodies could be used solely to exacerbate current injustices. They might also be sought after to create a more diverse professional and managerial class to manage more efficiently the diverse human resources in the labor market, or to reliably control social resistance with a more diverse police force without anyone identifying this as a problem. This is not just a bad political outcome, it would mean that the epistemic relations between diverse communities would not change. The power does not change hand, that processes of knowledge production remain hierarchical and elitist, perfectly mirroring the colonial practices of the past. Colonizers long needed a comprador class to mediate class and caste divisions, and I still think the term colonizers remains relevant, though we now have an increasingly multiracial and multi-ethnic colonizing elite. Another way to put this concern is that capital extraction would continue to operate in the epistemic realm in such a way that inequality is exacerbated rather than redressed. So we might think of this as a kind of extractivist epistemology. Even if identity diversity is now understood by wider sectors to have epistemic value, the question remains what kind of value, for whom, toward what end, and who decides. Let's just look at the biotech example a bit more for a minute. Transnational biotech companies have lately recognized the immense botanical knowledge of, for example, Amazonian peoples who've lived in continuous and thriving communities and rainforests where critical but rare plants grow with important medicinal qualities. Yet capitalist approaches to this knowledge have largely been extractive. Arturo Escobar, Mauricio Pardo, and others, lots of others have been doing work on this. Transnational pharmaceutical companies want to extract the knowledge from indigenous communities, even while the tribal populations are then forcibly displaced, in some cases becoming available labor for the companies who have taken their land. Conferring patents and private control over natural organisms is today fought in the courts as biopiracy, and Vandana Shiva calls this the heart of the new colonialism. So a certain amount of scientific knowledge is today afforded to indigenous groups, but there remains dramatic differences in views about what Pardo and Escobar call constructions of nature, the interpretive frame of biodiversity, and the requirements as well as the goals of resource management. Progressive NGOs are calling for biodemocracy against biopiracy and bioimperialism. So this is a battle over who controls ideas about knowledge, and I think what is at stake here is not just the knowledge of diverse groups, but the epistemologies of diverse groups. When bits of botanical information are extracted from living communities who are then destroyed, is knowledge retained? Are future knowledge projects possible? In the South Pacific island of Togo, the herbal product kava has been vigorously mined and harvested and packaged as an expensive anti-anxiety drug available without prescription in the West. You can go buy kava at your local natural food store. But Togo Islanders embed their use of kava within complex community practices that they argue is essential to its efficacy. Can double-blind tests work on this, isolating placebo effects, adequately judging the outcomes for Togo Islanders? Extractive capitalism encourages an extractive epistemic practice that foreshortens the knowledge benefits by refusing to engage with the complex and diverse epistemologies and communal practices that are at play in these encounters. So we have today a recognition of the value of epistemic diversity that is managing to exacerbate sometimes the conditions of epistemic injustice and maintain colonial relations of power. So obviously this should be of epistemic concern and should not be interpreted as merely political. What kind of knowledge is getting extracted and what kind of knowledge is not getting extracted, or perhaps what kind of knowledge is not even extractable. So that's the first of the concerns about diverse knowledge practices. The second related concern I'm going to draw from a speaker, I guess you very recently had, Olufemi Otaiwo, from his book, Elite Capture. He characterizes elite capture as occurring when, quote, the elite few, meaning the elite few in a given marginalized group, steer resources and institutions that could serve the many toward their own narrower interests and aims, unquote. So it is the usual way that, quote, socially advantaged people tend to gain control over benefits meant for everyone, unquote. And his examples range from the struggles within countries such as the United States, but also in the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, as critically examined by theorists such as Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon. What's particularly interesting about Taiwo's development of this concern is his application to current day forms of what we might think of as applied standpoint epistemology, in which epistemic deference to persons from oppressed groups is applied as a general norm. This can be a performance intended mainly for public relations, as mentioned earlier, providing just enough privilege so that it reflects well on those conferring the deference and their institutions. But the more interesting point Taiwo makes is that whatever the motivations behind the deference are, when it is enacted to whoever is in the room, we have a problem. And the problem may be a form of elite capture. How did they get in the room? Is deference to the 112,000 Nigerians living in the United States who have advanced degrees doing anything for the 82 million Nigerians who live in poverty? So he's urging us to consider the room itself. Who constructed the room? How did its arguments come to be there? Will a deference within these limits have any impact, and exactly what kind of impact will it have? I think Taiwo makes a good case against operationalizing the epistemic value of diversity in such a way that it is unlikely to make structural change. And I think the critics of Bollinger versus Grutter have legitimate concerns about instrumentalizing non-majority knowers. So what are we to do? Okay, so I'll try to say something about that in my concluding section. The basic claim that social identities are relevant to epistemic outcomes has increasingly strong support. There's more and more case studies. There's good philosophical argumentation. Sometimes I think the conservative critics are taking advantage of our genuine weak spots, though. Identity inclusion and deference can be formulaic, performative only, applied in such a way that the main motivation seems to be to protect those with power or the basic systems in place. Here, then, is the key to change. What would it mean to recognize the epistemic value of diversity without allowing this to buy us off, or simply stabilize current power flows? Obviously, we have to think bigger. We have to think more contextually, and we have to set aside formulas. In a bold move, Taiwo argues that the people of Flint, Michigan, who suffered from dangerous water supplies delivered to them by the state, need first and foremost to have clean water. A diverse pool of engineers may be a good idea, but the main criterion of success is whether poor communities get safe water. Related to this, he suggests, following Cabral, that we clarify what we are about here. Systemic change large enough to bring about justice. The PAIGC, which is the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, example he draws from mid-20th century anti-colonial movement, in its war against Portuguese colonialism, explained this clearly. The PAIGC said their struggle was against colonialism as a system, not against the people of Portugal. Even further, Cabral and other leaders held that they were on the side of the Portuguese people against its reactionary, colonialist, military, undemocratic government. So diversity is, as I said at the beginning, a slippery, ambiguous, vague term. How we draw the lines must be context sensitive and context specific. More than half of the border guards in the United States Border Patrol at the Mexican border are today Latinx. They are officiating racial discrimination at the border, family separation, and both unjust and immoral treatment of refugees. The paramilitary Texas Rangers, who use migrants for target practice in the Texas deserts, are another matter. Nearly all white, animated by white nationalism, operating with methods continuous with the U.S. colonial practice at the border since the Mexican-American War in 1848. But the ending of the practices and the ideas that have led to this human rights catastrophe will not be met by a formula of ethnic and racial integration. The United States government does need to learn some practices of epistemic deference, however, mostly to peoples and countries and governments outside its borders, especially those in Central America, such as where I'm from. I'm doubtful that we could take DEI initiatives and redefine them to do what's needed about neocolonial relations that continue to organize transnational relations. Instead of defending DEI initiatives against conservative attack, as I've just done here, we need to create a larger vision of our ultimate aims. So I'm sure it may seem at this point that I've veered too far afield, starting with a nicely focused paper on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and ending with global revolution. But I think this is the sort of move that Taiwo is leading us toward, that DEI projects are circumscribed in such a way that they're perfectly compatible with the sort of elite capture that he's concerned with, don't really do justice to the lessons of the epistemic relevance of diversity. Diverse knowers must be given the power, must take the power to reframe the questions and projects from the ground up, not simply to augment the outcomes of existing projects. Taiwo names this a move to constructive politics, and he explains what constructive politics means in the context of diversity initiative as follows. Here's a quote. He says, "A constructive politics pursues specific goals or end results rather than aiming to avoid complicity in injustices that we assume will mostly persist anyway. If it's epistemology or knowledge practices we're concerned about," this is ongoing, I'm still quoting Taiwo, "then a constructive politics focuses on institutions and practices of information gathering that are strategically useful for challenging social injustices themselves, not just the symptoms manifest in the room we happen to be in today," unquote. And I think he's not trying to sideline concerns for diversity, and there certainly are some leftists that go in that direction. Taiwo explains that the PAIGC, which is the model he uses throughout for anti-colonialism, foregrounded questions of diversity. He says, quote, the full involvement of women in the liberation struggle was an explicit goal of the organization and was reflected in its organizing practices and regulations," unquote. These practices included quotas in the elected village councils, consciousness-raising sessions in rural areas, and a women's militia as a section of the armed wing of the group. So the key is how we understand the function of diversification, public relations for existing organizations, avoiding complicity as a way to avoid criticism or making real change. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Linda. A lot to think about, really. Showing how problematic determining the value, the epistemic value of diversity can be. And the examples you use, some are very close to my heart, because, for example, in Nigeria, in any compound, you would find bitter leaf. That's what it's called, because it's very bitter. And you basically take what you need. You could boil some for a fever or anything. And recently, in the last 2 years, the biotech companies are shipping them out of Nigeria to make some sort of cancer drugs, put them in capsules. This shows, a lot to think about. Where do we draw the line? How do we determine who is benefiting from the value of diversity? Thank you so much, Linda. Very interesting, thought-provoking talk. I will hand over to Bjorn to lead the question comment session. Bjorn.
Yeah, thank you very much. Please feel free to raise your little digital hands or to put a question in the chat if you prefer for me to read it out. Let me quickly see if we have any questions so far. We're probably all a bit struck by this absurd richness of that presentation. Yeah, let me see again. Yeah, Elvis, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, perhaps I should begin by, when you spoke about the Beck's picture by Tudor, I was just thinking about how powerful the media has become, how they play a role in this sort of in manipulating understanding and interpretation. So picking out that single quote and pushing that forward in manipulating how people understood the speech itself. And media does that, not just the usual traditional medias, television, and the social media itself. If our understanding is so manipulated, how then do we really have authentic understanding of diversity itself and the value that comes from it? If media plays a key role in how we understand basically anything, and that understanding is often manipulated. I know it's a lot of bad in there. I hope you get my point.
Yeah, it's hard to be optimistic these days about the growing opportunities for communication, because they seem to just make things worse and worse. But I think it's, I think the new forms of communicative opportunities in social media are opportunities as well as problems, right? So it's easier to get on, it's easier to write short things and that get out. There's more platforms, there's more of a diversity of news outlets, and things get picked up and circulated around. So I don't think there's cause for absolute cynicism, despite the algorithms. There's a lot of really good critique going on about the algorithms and how they're racist and so forth. And there's some effort to force the problem is the tech companies have no democratic responsibility. They have no democratic accountability or oversight. But I think that's the fight that's being made by, for example, the Electronic Freedom Foundation in the United States. You can go on their website and see what they're doing. They're fighting facial recognition, they're fighting surveillance techniques, and they're calling for more democratic oversight of all of these things. So it's a big struggle going on to change the way social media is set up, and to deprivatize to the extent we can and create more democratic. But it's it's very much a double-edged sword. I think what's worth doing is, I think we can see sort of basic big line sort of trends in current discussions in which there are these binaries set up between political orientation and scientific progress. And, the argument that just shut up about diversity and let the science. So the fact that our tech firms that control our public communications are the least diverse sectors of our economy, right? We gained diversity in manufacturing, we gained diversity in healthcare and education, and now the tech firms are the most important part of our economy, and it's a bunch of white guys, mostly, and white people in general, calling all these shots. So the idea that technological advance doesn't require diversity, continually needs the kind of, rehearsing of arguments that I'm sure you're all familiar with that I gave here. It's worth doing to break down those ideas that politics is a sideline issue to scientific advance. No, it's not a sideline issue. It's actually a feature of making scientific advances possible. Not only because science and knowledge is not simply about crunching numbers, it's about asking questions and formulating knowledge projects, coming up with hypotheses and interpreting the data and so forth. So I think it's worth spending our time in the public sphere breaking down these binaries that are very powerful still in the public culture, and that create a misunderstanding. And I think what you can do is, you don't have to see the regular populations as stupid. I don't think they're stupid. I think there is this common sense that you can draw from, as I try to do. Sotomayor's views are common sense. Of course, identity makes a difference, and people on the ground know that identity makes a difference. In daily life, you know that identity makes a difference, and you figure out how to think about sometimes identity when you need to know something, and you figure out who you want to ask. It's a common sense view. We need to draw it out. We need to make it academically respectable. We need to make it repeat, and we need to make it strong as we can in the public sphere.
Thank you very much. Richard, please.
Thank you, Linda, for a wonderful and very clear and interesting presentation. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, you talked about DEI and how it could sometimes be just PR. Sarah Ahmed's writing on that. And I wondered what you thought about, if you could speak about issues such as the concept of institutional racism. Now, this is very relevant in the UK at the moment, because the London Metropolitan Police have just been, the report has just been released, which basically condemns them for institutional racism and sexism. There was a report maybe about 18 months ago, which made a similar kind of claim about institutional racism, and the Conservative government basically denied this. And what I see going on in some of those discourses is an attempt to see racism as about individual subjectivity alone. And so, you know, it's a variation on the there are always a few bad apples kind of argument. And I wondered if you had anything to say about that, the challenge of kind of speaking across and speaking to those people who don't even accept the argument for structural social injustice as a basis for kind of moving forward. That's my first question. My second question, briefly, is you talked really in an excellent way with examples about kind of extractive approaches to knowledge and epistemology, and the dangers of a kind of, if you like, additive approach, where you just claim to diversify by adding, you know, diversity. I wondered if you had any thoughts on philosophy as a field, and the kind of turn towards a kind of multicultural diversity, but one which basically keeps in place the kind of dominant white Western epistemologies, if we want to put it that way, that and if you had any thoughts on that. So they're my two questions.
Yeah, those are great. That's a lot of questions.
Yeah, sorry.
They're really great. I mean, it's happened in the United States too, with the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, that we're moving to structural racism and institutional racism in the public sphere. You know, this conversation is starting more, which is really good. But people don't know how to think about it. Don't know, because I think actually that it does require us to redefine what we mean by racism. It requires us to sort of go against some of the prominent everyday meanings of racism, which is about conscious intent, intentional beliefs, you know, and people, and you know, conservatives are rejecting this because one of the ways in which we define structural racism is based on outcomes. So it's not an aggregate of individual intent. You could have a metropolitan police that are in which the aggregate has anti-racist intent. And of course, anti-racist intent doesn't sufficiently establish that you're going to have anti-racist actions, because people's understanding of what anti-racism requires may be insufficient. But I'm really coming to the view these days that we should move entirely away from individual racism. Entirely away from it. I don't want to let people off the hook. I don't want to let people not hold responsibility, but we're putting so much focus on prosecuting a single policeman to the full extent of the law, which is an important thing to do. It connects, but we're focusing away from the culture of the police, so that people of color who are hired into the police are inculcated into a set of practices, a set of ideas, the blue line, protecting each other above all else, and so forth, that they can enact a racist practice, even with individual anti-racist intent. And so I think we need to be honest about the fact that we're redefining racism. We're redefining racism to look at racist outcomes. You can have well-meaning university administrators or public school, or I know public means a different thing in England, but school administrators who have the intent to be inclusive, and yet we find fewer students of color getting into the top elite schools. So we have to, what critical race theory argues is you look at the outcomes and then you work backwards, right? So let's start with the outcomes. If the outcomes are problematic, look problematic in some way, then you start backwards to try to get to an understanding of how those outcomes get reproduced generation after generation after generation. And that's going to take you well beyond the sphere of individual intent. It's going to take you to the culture of the place. So I think that that's what I'd say there. And I think that we should be honest about, there's multiple ways to define racism. The usual view people have about conscious intent, that's legitimate, that's important, but it's really inadequate to understanding how racism gets perpetuated in large systems and how things can look neutral and just based on quality, and then produce these racially disparate outcomes and ethnically disparate outcomes. So I think we could acknowledge there's multiple, let's have multiple definitions of racism. But I think we're going to have to do that to get to the institutional racism and the structural racism conversation. And obviously this is what we need to do. And I think the reason why the conservatives resist is because they know damn well this is what's going to make a difference, right? That moving away from individual intent, which is so hard to prove in the law, it's like just impossible. Hard, unless you find somebody is spewing on Facebook, some racist stuff on Facebook, then you've got the goods on them, then you can get them. But generally speaking, it's really hard to get evidence of individual racist conscious intent. You can't get that. What you can get is what happened just recently is the murder of another Black man in Virginia because 11 police kneeled on him until he was dead. You get actions, you get outcomes, and you can get statistics on those. And then you work backwards. This is what critical legal studies taught, critical race studies in the legal arena, is you work backwards from outcomes. And then you think pragmatically about practices and cultural changes that will produce new outcomes. And you can test that in an empirical way. Philosophy, yes. Philosophy is the test case, the sine qua non example. And I have, done some thinking about this. I think that there's structural racism, in philosophy too. There's a kind of assumption that Eurocentrism is justified. That the idea of the canon being 95% European is is taken by many people to be justified. Sometimes it's not because they think nobody else in the world has a brain, but because they think Europe had all the money, Europe had the leisure time, Europe had this, had overcome scarcity and could fund a bunch of people just to sit around thinking and experimenting in their garages, which they did through the modern period, and developed science and technology and philosophy. And so they think, it's just a fact that European ideas are the best and brightest, as Matthew Arnold said. But here's the thing, I have been in department meetings where people have espoused this idea who don't really know anything about the writings and the thought and the practices and the cultures of other peoples, who speak only English, who haven't read anything else. So it's pretty easy to point out that they're jumping to conclusions there. And I think philosophy as a whole is jumping to conclusions. We have to open up our thinking about philosophical ideas. We also have to do the methodological work and the conceptual work to change understandings of what counts as philosophy. Maybe we need to use different terms, as some people argue, and the methodologies of philosophy. So it's going to require people think, well, show me the text. And of course, some people have shown the text from Africa and so forth, in which slavery was debated, in which human rights. I think the conception of human rights did not come from the West originally. I think there's some good evidence for all of this, but what people want is they want to hold their standard of what a philosophical argument is, what a philosophical paper should look like, and then you have to show them like an example of that from the Inca or something, and it's not going to work quite like that. So there has to be a reconsideration of our basic understanding of reason, of philosophical reasoning and argumentation. And part of this is, in the West, just to make this one last point, I think is a rethinking of the relationship between religion and philosophy, because in Western philosophy, the tendency is to see the development of modern philosophy, especially modern epistemology, as overcoming traditional societies, meaning overcoming religious beliefs that are not questioned. And there's, some new work amongst historians of philosophy that are questioning this, like those who are pointing out that Descartes was a student of the Jesuits and got his whole idea about doubt from the Jesuits, passions of the soul. I mean, it's quite interesting when we retell more accurately the story of the history of Western philosophy, of modern European philosophy. What we find is a more complicated story. The Arabs didn't simply hold Aristotle's books in their libraries, right? There was interpretation going on. There was analysis going on. So as you guys know better than anybody. So we have to retell the story of European philosophy, but we also have to rethink the way in which we define it and the basic methods that we think of as non-negotiable.
Thanks, that was great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The next question would come from Sarah. You just turned on your camera. Do you want to read out your question yourself, or do you want me to do it? I'll do it. Okay. So Sarah is asking, do you have any thoughts on powerful reactionary elites co-opting the discourse of diversity in order to corruptly take power of institutions? I'm thinking about what's happening in Israel right now. The fascist government arguing that the Supreme Court left elites and that thus the government needs to diversify it by bringing in their own people, thus erasing the independence of the Supreme Court and turning the country practically in a non-democratic one. And she adds to that, even if it's true that the Supreme Court are academic elites and that the need for diversifying is real, this is co-opted by reactionary forces.
Wow, that's really interesting. I have been following what's going on in Israel, but I didn't know about that particular proposal. So that's quite interesting. It's absolutely going to be an ongoing problem of what we might think of as the recuperation of diversity initiatives. Or the co-optation or the use of diversity initiatives by the right. And I think that the reason it works is because people are, are not clear on what does it mean to diversify, what really counts as diversity. We should raise the bar to see what really counts as diversification and what really the aims are. That's what I was trying to expand on. So, I think we have to get involved in these discussions when these examples come up. The other thing, though, that I do also think we need to get our heads around is the fact that all forms of fascism that are arising in Europe and North America today, and other parts of the world as well. There's a wave of fascism from Brazil to the United States, to Hungary, to even Germany again, Sweden. Not all of it is white nationalism. Some of it is comes in the form of Christian nationalism and other forms in which there can be multiple racial and ethnic and religious groups who support it, as in Brazil, most obviously. I mean, obviously, India is another example. So I think we need to I still think we need the term white supremacy, and we're trying to get that term and that concept to circulate more, and to think about transnational white supremacy. That was the effort of my former colleague who died a couple of years ago, Charles Mills. He did a lot of work to bring out the ways in which white supremacy still organizes our world. I know this is part of what Olufemi Otaiwo's work is doing, but it's not the only term we need. I think we need other terms as well to understand the attraction of fascism to some Latinx people in the United States, and as well as South America and Central America, and the possibility of developing some, modest level of multiracial, multi-ethnic formations of fascist governments, and specifically in some parts of Europe and the United States, and figure out how to we need to be careful and not be too simplistic about our analyses as well. On the left, I think we accuse others of being too simplistic. I think sometimes we have to also be careful and not be too simplistic and see all forms of fascism as white nationalism. Most of them are, because it's about replacement, it's about settler colonialism, it's about the ill-gotten gains of the colonized past manifesting themselves in social movements and migrations of peoples. But there's a possibility that some people of color will buy into and will try to be participants and even sometimes leaders of these different movements. And I think we have to do some thinking about that and have a kind of a multiple understanding of the emergence of fascism, in which they don't all take the same form or require an absolute ethnic homogeneity. I think what I'm talking about is probably more relevant to the the hemisphere that I'm speaking in, North, Central, and South America than it is in where you guys are. But it's still, but there's some elements of it still there as well. So if that helps.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it seems from the chat, I think that Sarah is very satisfied with that answer. We will be able to take 2 more questions. So I have a question by Yvette now, and then a question I will read out from the chat by Sukanya. Yvette, please.
Hello, Linda. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm here in Tennessee, and I'm experiencing life in the crosshairs of the woke attack, trying to teach in a context where I have parents that are asking to hear both sides, that there's this fear of a liberal agenda in the schools, as we well know with the whole CRT discourse and so on. And I found it really helpful, this idea of understanding diversity in terms of political diversity and diversity in terms of identity or social diversity, which I think parents that are being activated politically do not understand that. And so when I'm in a classroom space, I'm being challenged because of my social diversity agenda. And then parents want diversity, but they're thinking of it as a political diversity. And so I'm curious what you think about what to do when a political diversity then harms the social identity diversities, right? That an agenda, for example, that is overtly anti-trans. How does one teach diversity and encourage diversity of both sides when I'm asked, I need to have, if I promote an anti-racist curriculum, I need to show both sides. What is the other side of an anti-racist curriculum, is what I'm curious about. And I find myself drawn to ideas like Megan Bowler's of affirmative action pedagogy that silences some voices. Is there a space that certain voices don't have equal credence when we talk about diversity, when we talk about inclusion?
Yeah, well, I salute your efforts and wish you the best. I was just in Tennessee for a couple of days giving a talk at Vanderbilt, and I know it's a very, very red state. I think that the political diversity on the one hand is a legitimate point, but I wanted to make 2 qualifications with it, which maybe you can convey to the parents. One is that it's about the point of political diversity. The reasoning behind it is to say you don't want to have such uniformity that nobody asks critical questions, and that's a legitimate epistemic point. You don't want to have everybody in lockstep and there's no sphere of disagreement or criticism, because the reason why you don't want that is because that's not good for developing our understanding. So that, I think that's a legitimate point, is to allow for critical questions. But what that implies is that you're in a process of inquiry. You're engaged in a process of inquiry. You're not simply voting where everybody gets a vote. You're engaged in a shared project of understanding. And that's what we're doing now in this country. We're in a shared project of understanding the trans movement, trans kids, the needs of trans kids, these new categories. And so how do we advance our collective understanding of that? We need to have critical questions. We need to have a certain amount of openness, but there are facts, and here I begin to go conservative epistemologically. I mean, the fact is, in the history of the world, this is not new. There's never been and I just was reading, and there's a good piece by a rabbi that was in the New York Times over the weekend about how in Hebrew there was, if you were born either a boy or a girl or a tum-tum, they had another term for kids who were in between. And then they had yet another term in ancient Hebrew for kids who, you know, at around puberty would manifest differently. So this is not, yeah, and that's mostly, you know, involving intersex, but that's an opening to the issue that there's always been more than two. It's just an absolute fact. The biology does not support an absolute exclusivist binary. No biologist who's, you know, worth their salt today would defend an absolutist biological binary. So that position is just off the table. The question still is, you know, there's many questions of legitimate debate still, of course, in terms of, you know, age appropriate. I mean, sure, there's going to continue to be debate, and there's going to continue to be, and I think sometimes those of us on other sides of social movements that are trying to advance a cause don't want to complexify, don't want to nuance, don't want to allow for variability. But I think that's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to oversimplify, because I think publics are not as stupid as we sometimes think they are in the academy. You know, I think many publics, you know, can get their head around the fact that there may be differences and variety on this question. So I think it's okay to, you know, have people want to have political diversity, but there is a limit to that. You can't let people say slaves were treated well. There may have been one single slave somewhere who was treated well, but this is not the story of slavery. That doesn't help the conversation. It just and it infantilizes people, right? You're infantilizing them when you say, yes, you can hold on to that wrong idea. If you treat people like adults, you challenge them and you say there's limits to what can be part of this. I think the other thing that is important to do, there was another good piece in the Times written by Henry Louis Gates, you can probably find, where he addresses this by going through all the debates among African-American race theorists over the last 100 years. I mean, there's, you know, lots and lots of different views. So it's not a uniform view. People hate each other. They call each other all kinds of names, right? I mean, it is a lively academic and political dispute over how to address racism, how to define it, how to address it, how to move forward. So the fear of liberal lockstep, first of all, we have to address that fear by not engaging in it. And second of all, we have to address that fear by talking about, you know, how many ongoing debates there are, sometimes quite productive debates over race and class, you know, race versus class, and how to understand the relationship between those two. So in that way, I think you can, when you're dealing with hostile publics, sometimes you can say, yes, you have some legitimate concerns here, and I am going to address those concerns in this way, right? So you're not saying just shut up. You're saying, okay, let's talk about why is it important to have more than liberal voices? What's the reasoning behind it? How can we pursue what's legitimate there? And what are bad ways to pursue that? But I really wish you the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your answer.
All right, thank you very much for that. And we have time for a quick last question. Sukanya was asking, what is the importance of representation of different communities in diversity initiatives?
Maybe who's the person could say a little bit more about what she or he means?
Yeah, Sukanya, if you're still here, feel free to put it in the chat, or maybe let me quickly check if she's still with us.
I'm just trying to get a sense of.
Yeah, there she is. If you want to, please feel free to put it in the chat or to speak. Not sure where I don't. Oh, there she is. I'm not sure if she can hear me at the moment. Sukanya, are you there?
Oh, yes. Actually, I just want to know that how is a representation of some community is important in, including them in the in their inclusion in the diversity initiative. So, for example, if somebody is from one is a woman of a color, so their representation, as well as if somebody is from some indigenous community, so their representation. So their representation in diversity, who is going to represent them, and what will be the actual representation? What's that importance in this whole diversity initiative that I wanted to know? Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, I would say that, representationalism can be done wrongly in so many ways, like quotas in electoral bodies around the world. There's quota systems for gender representation, quota systems in United Nations organizations that I support quotas in many cases, but it can be done in a very wrong way that doesn't really provide somebody who can. How can you have somebody who represents the entirety of women of color or the entirety of women of color in a particular nation? So there has to be a very context-specific look at what representationalism would work in a particular condition, and what the aims would be, and how we would test out whether or not it was, producing good epistemic outcomes, for example, rather than just sort of fulfilling a very superficial kind of requirement that then provides public relations for the organization, a kind of cover for the legitimacy of the organization. That's one thing I would say. And I think, for example, in the academy, we have lots of statistics now at every university, how many faculty are Latinx, how many faculty are female, how many faculty are Black or Arab, etc. And to tell you the truth, those large aggregate numbers tell us almost nothing, because you have to look at where those faculty are. Those faculty are in education. Those faculty are in, sometimes they're in healthcare. They're not in philosophy. They're not in the humanities. We have less good diversity of ethnic representation in philosophy and in English departments, in fact, arts departments. So you really have to beware of the large aggregate statistics and really push further to see where there are pockets that are completely that have very little representation of diversity. So I don't know if this gets at your question, but I think that the question of representationalism is still a legitimate concern, but it can be done poorly on purpose. In so many ways we're discovering today that we know today, we have to have some analysis and some oversight over the ways in which representational diversity is pursued, or it can actually do more harm than good.
Thank you very, very much. And with that, I'm going to give it back to Elvis for his final words. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Linda. Very engaging and thought-provoking talk, as well as questions from the audience. So thank you all for coming and for participating. And then we're very grateful that you made that time. We know you're very busy as well. And of course, we look forward to more times with you. Perhaps one day we can have a workshop or a colloquium, and we can invite you here to see you in flesh.
Yes, please.
So thank you all.
Thank
You all for coming.
I like London. I'll come
Yeah,
to
yeah. It would be really nice to have you here at some
We
point.
will not forget that.
Yeah. The next lecture will be in the last Friday of April, April 28th, and that will be a hybrid one. So we'll have Professor Mavelli here in person, but it will be also online. Just put in the lecture details on the chat, so you can put that on your diary. And yeah, see you all in April. Have a good day, Linda, and everyone.
Thanks again, Linda.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Nice to meet
Goodbye.
you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.